Once upon a time, in a faraway land, there lived an old wise man. He lived in a palace on top of a hill in a far, far away, unknown land, far from all the other people. And he kept to himself most of the time, and the only people there were the people who worked at the palace, who tended the lands and took care of the building and grew the food. And the wise man just kept to himself, and he liked to read and sometimes wander the hills. But in the palace, he kept the world's greatest collection of fine silks, fine silk robes, and treasures, and blankets, and tapestries of this colorful, gorgeous silk, from which nobody actually knew where this silk had come from. Even the wise man himself was not completely sure of their origin. All he knew is that they were treasures, treasures that need to be kept and stored for the rest of time. And every now and then he would go into his collection and put on some of the robes and wear them around. One day he decided to put on the finest robe of all. It shone with every color of the rainbow, shades of purple and blue and green, and shades of yellow and orange and red, and beautiful shapes and designs all over, from all the way from his shoulder to his feet. And when he stepped outside with this robe, the sun seemed to glisten and shine and reflect all the colors around. And so he decided to go for a walk while wearing this magical robe. Normally, he wouldn't even leave the palace wearing this particular robe. But on this beautiful spring day, he felt the urge to wander. And so he walked, and he walked, and he walked, and he walked very far, farther than he usually does, until he came to a rock upon a hill, looking far, far away from the palace, but he could see it in the distance, so he knew he was not lost. And he sat upon this rock, and he pondered life, and he thought about his robes, and he thought about the magic that they must contain, and where they might have came from, and what he would do with them. And he did a sit spot on this rock, the longest sit spot he'd ever done. And just as he was getting ready to stand up and begin his walk back home, he leaned over on the rock, starting to put his legs down to stand up. But he heard a little rip, for a piece of his robe had gotten snagged on a sharp piece of the rock and tore off completely. He looked down in terror to see a piece of this finest robe sitting on the ground. And he picked it up. It was an orange piece of the robe, bright orange, in fact. And he threw it to the wind in frustration. There goes my beautiful, finest robe. But just as he threw it, this orange piece, to the wind, it looked as if it had come to life. And it seemed to fly by in front of his face. And he couldn't believe his eyes. Did that really just happen? He thought to himself. The wind just picked up and took that silk. But then it came back the other direction. And it kept flying around. And so he thought to himself, is this real or is this my imagination? Am I dreaming? I better try again. Let's see what happens if I put another piece of this robe to the wind. And he tore off another small piece, threw it to the wind, and lo and behold, it once again seemed to come to life in the wind, almost as if it had two little wings flapping. And then he tried again and again, tearing pieces of robe, throwing them all to the wind, until he looked around him and he was surrounded by an amazing cloud of these new creatures of all colors, rainbow, flying in the wind, for his pieces of robe, each and every one had come to life and seemed to be flying around him in a swarm. He couldn't believe it. And as he looked down, after spending lots of time watching these magical beings fly, he looked down to realize he had cut his robe to shreds, and now he was naked. Oh my gosh, how was he going to walk home? But he didn't even care about that because he was so in love and amazed by these creatures that he'd created from his robe, flying all around him. And he decided, in excitement, to run all the way home, making sure the creatures followed him. He ran home, bringing the creatures, the flying beings, with him. They followed him all through the hills, back to the palace. And when he arrived at the palace doors, he busted in. No longer wearing a robe, he forgot that he was naked, but followed by this cloud of magical rainbow flying animals. And he pronounced to the palace people, "Look at what I have created with my magic robes. Look at what I have brought into the world to share with all of humanity. I will call these creatures butterflies, and I will take the rest of my robes and send them to the world and fill the world with beautiful butterflies for every single human to enjoy for the rest of time." And so it was. This old wise man was the creator of the beautiful butterflies we know today. Stars and moon and sun, my story now is done.